Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of American history. I'm your host, and tonight we venture into the remote mountains of North Carolina to a story that has remained buried in dusty archives for over a century. A story that challenges our understanding of isolation, morality, and the terrible things that can happen when human beings are left too long in the shadows, away from the eyes of society. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Are you watching this alone, in your room? Perhaps it's late at night, the house is quiet, and you're the only one awake. Or maybe you're listening during your commute, trying to pass the time with something that will make you think. Whatever your situation, I want you to leave a comment below telling me where you are and what time it is as you watch this. It helps me understand this community we're building together, this gathering of people who aren't afraid to look into the abyss of human nature. Now, let me take you back to the year 1883, North Carolina, the Appalachian Mountains, a region of profound beauty and equally profound isolation. These were not the gentle hills of pastoral America. These were steep, unforgiving peaks covered in dense forest, where communities were separated by miles of wilderness, where help could be days away, and where families lived and died in a silence broken only by the wind through the pines. In a particularly remote hollow, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that disappeared during winter storms, stood a cabin, the Edwards cabin. It had been built decades earlier by pioneers who sought land of their own, who wanted distance from the complications of town life, from judgment, from interference. By 1883, that cabin was home to only two people, Scott Edwards, 28 years old, and his sister, Mary Edwards, 26. Their parents had died 3 years prior, both taken by tuberculosis within weeks of each other. The disease had swept through that isolated hollow like a biblical plague, leaving the two siblings orphaned, with nothing but the land their family had worked for generations. They had no other relatives, no aunts or uncles to take them in, no cousins who might offer assistance. They were alone, truly alone, in a way that is difficult for us to comprehend in our modern connected world. The small community of Hickory Ridge, the nearest settlement some 8 miles away, had tried to help at first. Reverend James Cross of the Methodist Church had made the difficult journey to the cabin several times, bringing food, offering prayers, suggesting that perhaps the siblings might consider moving closer to town, where Mary might find work as a seamstress or a schoolteacher, where Scott might join one of the logging crews that worked the mountain timber. But each time, the Reverend was turned away, politely at first, then coldly, and finally, in the spring of 1883, with open hostility. Scott Edwards had met him at the property line with a rifle and made it clear that the Reverend's visits were no longer welcome. The Edwards siblings wanted to be left alone. They wanted no charity, no interference, no judgment from the good people of Hickory Ridge. And so they were left alone. The months passed. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring again. The cabin remained isolated, its windows dark, its chimney occasionally smoking but otherwise giving no sign of the life within. Until the sounds began. In the late summer of 1883, a hunter named Thomas Whitley was tracking a deer through the woods when he passed within a quarter-mile of the Edwards property. He later told the sheriff that he heard something that made his blood run cold and sent him running back to town without his quarry. He heard the sound of an infant crying, not the healthy cry of a newborn, but a weak, thin wailing that seemed to come and go on the mountain wind. A sound that had no business existing in a cabin where only 2 adults were supposed to live. A sound that would set in motion a chain of events leading to one of the most disturbing discoveries in North Carolina history. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened in that isolated cabin, we need to understand the world these siblings inhabited, the pressures they faced, and the darkness that can grow in the human heart when society's watchful eyes are no longer present. To understand the Edwards case, we must first understand the world of Appalachian, North Carolina in 1883. This was the America still healing from the wounds of the Civil War, which had ended less than 20 years earlier. The South was in the midst of Reconstruction's aftermath, a period of economic hardship, social upheaval, and profound transformation. But in the remote mountain communities, far from the cities where these changes were most visible, life continued much as it had for generations. The Appalachian region was a world unto itself. These mountain communities were settled primarily by Scots-Irish immigrants and their descendants, people who had come to America seeking land and independence. They built their homes in the hollows and valleys, cleared fields from the forest, and lived lives of remarkable self-sufficiency. They raised their own food, made their own clothes, and relied on their neighbors only in the most dire circumstances. But this independence came at a cost. The isolation was profound. In winter, when snow blocked the mountain passes, families could go months without seeing another soul outside their immediate household. Medical care was primitive or non-existent. Education was sporadic at best. The church, usually Methodist or Baptist, was often the only institution that connected these scattered homesteads into something resembling a community. According to records from the Hickory Ridge Methodist Church, preserved in the North Carolina State Archives, the Edwards family had been members of the congregation since the church's founding in 1847. The original Edwards patriarch, Jonathan Edwards, had been one of the 5 men who built the church with their own hands, cutting timber from their land and hauling it down the mountain on mule-drawn sledges. The family had a reputation for being hard-working but reserved. They kept to themselves, attended services regularly, but spoke little, and were known for paying their debts and expecting others to do the same. Jonathan Edwards and his wife Martha had raised 3 children on their mountain property. The eldest son had died of fever at age 12. The daughter had married a man from the next valley and moved away. That left their youngest, Robert Edwards, to inherit the cabin and the land. Robert married a woman named Catherine Miller in 1854. Church records describe her as a quiet woman of good Christian character, though given to melancholy. The couple had 2 children, Scott, born in 1855, and Mary, born in 1857. For the first years of their lives, the Edwards family seemed unremarkable by the standards of their time and place. They worked their land, attended church when weather permitted, and raised their children in the stern, religious manner common to the region. Reverend James Cross, who began his ministry at Hickory Ridge in 1875, kept detailed journals that have survived to the present day. In an entry from September 1876, he wrote, "Visited the Edwards family today. The father, Robert, is a man of few words but clear. Devotion to Scripture. The mother seems overburdened by the harshness of mountain life. The children, Scott and Mary, are thin but healthy. The boy shows promise of his father's strength. The girl is uncommonly attached to her brother, rarely leaving his side even during the sermon." That last observation, seemingly innocent at the time, would take on a darker significance in hindsight. The turning point came in the spring of 1880. Robert Edwards began showing symptoms of tuberculosis, known then as consumption. The disease was a death sentence in these isolated mountains. There were no sanatoriums, no effective treatments, only the slow wasting away as the lungs failed. Robert died in August of that year, drowning in his own blood as the disease reached its final stage. Catherine, who had nursed him through his illness, began showing symptoms within weeks. By October, she too was bedridden. According to a letter written by Reverend Cross to the regional Methodist bishop, dated November 15th, 1880. Mrs. Catherine Edwards is in the final stages of consumption. I have visited twice in the past month, but the journey is arduous, and the family has requested I not return unless summoned. The son, Scott, has assumed all responsibilities for the household and his mother's care. The daughter, Mary, tends to her mother day and night. They are both 23 and 21 respectively, unmarried and now facing a future without parents or prospects. I fear greatly for their situation. Catherine Edwards died on December 3rd, 1880. Both parents were buried in the small family plot behind the cabin, their graves marked with simple wooden crosses that Scott carved himself. The property, such as it was, passed to Scott as the eldest male. He was now the head of the household, responsible for his sister and for maintaining the land that had been in his family for 2 generations. The community of Hickory Ridge tried to help. Several families offered to take Mary in as a housemaid or companion. The Reverend suggested that Scott might sell the property and use the money to start fresh in one of the growing towns in the flatlands to the east. But Scott refused all offers. He would not leave the land, and he would not be separated from his sister. This decision, while unusual, was not unprecedented in mountain culture. Families were expected to stay together, to honor the land their ancestors had worked. The community might have found it odd that a young woman wouldn't seek marriage, but in the economically depressed post-war South, there were many unmarried women, many broken families, many situations that deviated from the ideal. And so, Scott and Mary Edwards remained in their cabin, alone together, working the land as their parents had done. The community gradually stopped trying to help. They had their own problems, their own struggles to survive in that harsh landscape. If the Edwards siblings wanted to be left alone, then alone they would be. For nearly 3 years, that arrangement seemed to work. The cabin's chimney continued to smoke. Occasionally, Scott would be seen in Hickory Ridge, purchasing supplies with coins saved from selling furs or timber. He spoke to no one more than necessary and returned to the mountain as quickly as possible. Mary was never seen at all. The isolation was now complete. 2 young people, brother and sister, living alone in a cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, cut off from all social contact, with nothing but each other for company and the weight of their parents' deaths hanging over them like a shadow. And it was in that isolation, in that absence of watchful eyes and moral accountability, that something terrible began to grow. The first report came on August 12th, 1883. Thomas Whitley, a respected hunter and trapper who knew every trail in those mountains, arrived in Hickory Ridge just before sunset, his face pale and his hands trembling. He went directly to the home of Sheriff Edmund Garrett and insisted on making a formal statement. The sheriff's log, preserved in the Mitchell County Historical Society archives, records Whitley's testimony in careful, precise handwriting. On this day, August 12th, 1883, Thomas Whitley appeared at my residence at approximately 6:45 in the evening. He stated that while hunting in the vicinity of the Edwards property, at a distance he estimated to be a quarter-mile from the cabin, he heard distinctly the sound of an infant crying. He described the cry as weak and intermittent, lasting for several minutes before ceasing. Mr. Whitley states he heard this sound on 2 separate occasions during his time in that area, approximately 1 hour apart. When asked if he investigated the source, Mr. Whitley stated he did not approach the cabin due to Scott Edwards' known hostility toward visitors. Mr. Whitley appeared genuinely disturbed by what he heard. Sheriff Garrett made a note at the bottom of the entry. This report troubles me greatly. The Edwards siblings are not known to receive visitors, and there has been no indication of any woman being brought to that property. Will consult with Reverend Cross regarding appropriate action. But appropriate action was not immediately clear. The Edwards property was private land. Scott and Mary Edwards were adults, free to live as they chose. The sound of a baby crying, while strange, was not in itself evidence of a crime. Perhaps Mary had given birth. Perhaps Scott had taken a wife, without informing the community. Perhaps there was a simple explanation that would make the sheriff look foolish if he went barging up that mountain with accusations. So Sheriff Garrett waited. He discussed the matter quietly with Reverend Cross, who promised to attempt another visit to the cabin. But before that visit could take place, more reports began to arrive. On August 19th, a week after Whitley's testimony, a farmer named Jacob Hensley reported hearing similar sounds while checking his fence line on the eastern edge of his property, which bordered the Edwards land. He described it as a pitiful crying, like a babe in distress, but weak, so weak it made my heart hurt to hear it. On August 26th, Sarah Mitchell, wife of a local merchant, reported to her husband that she had heard disturbing sounds while foraging for mushrooms in the forest. She was reluctant to come forward officially, fearing ridicule, but her husband insisted the sheriff be informed. She described hearing not just crying, but what sounded like a woman's voice, raised in what might have been prayer or perhaps pleading, though the words were indistinct through the trees. The community began to talk. In a place where gossip was one of the few forms of entertainment, the Edwards siblings became a topic of intense speculation. The whispers were dark, hinting at things that decent people didn't discuss openly. What were those two doing up there, alone together for 3 years? Why would there be a baby? Whose baby could it be? Reverend Cross attempted to visit the property on September 3rd, 1883. His journal entry from that day is particularly revealing. I rode to the Edwards cabin with the intention of offering spiritual guidance and determining the truth of the recent reports. I was met at the property boundary by Scott Edwards, who was armed with his father's rifle. His appearance shocked me. He was gaunt, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed, his clothes filthy. When I called out that I meant only to help, he raised the rifle and told me in language I will not repeat here that if I valued my life I would turn around immediately. I saw no sign of Mary, though I called her name several times. Scott's only response was to fire a shot into the air above my head. I departed, convinced now that something terrible is occurring in that cabin, but uncertain how to proceed without causing violence. The Reverend's report to Sheriff Garrett finally spurred action. On September 10th, the sheriff rode up to the Edwards property, this time accompanied by 2 deputies. They found Scott Edwards waiting for them at the property line, rifle in hand, looking even worse than the Reverend had described. The sheriff's official report states, "Subject appeared malnourished and possibly ill." When questioned about reports of an infant on the property, subject became agitated and denied any such presence. When asked to allow us to verify this by inspecting the cabin, subject refused and stated that his sister was ill and could not be disturbed. When pressed, subject became verbally abusive and threatening. Due to the remote location and subject's armed state, I determined that forcing entry would likely result in bloodshed. We withdrew, but I have grave concerns about this situation. It was at this point that the first anonymous letter arrived. Written in careful, feminine handwriting on cheap paper, it was left at the sheriff's office door on the night of September 15th. The letter, which still exists in the case files, reads, "Sheriff Garrett, I write to you because I fear for my immortal soul if I stay silent. I have been on the mountain near the Edwards place twice in recent weeks, gathering herbs for medicine. Both times I heard crying. The second time, I crept closer and saw through the cabin window. What I saw has haunted my dreams. There was Mary Edwards, and she was with child again, her belly swollen. But, Sheriff, this is not the worst of it. I saw a small grave, freshly dug, behind the cabin, and I saw Scott Edwards standing over it, his head bowed, God forgive me for not coming forward sooner, but I am afraid of what they might do if they knew I had been watching. Please help them before more innocent blood is spilled. A Christian woman who fears God's judgment. Now pause for a moment and tell me in the comments what you think is happening so far. What could explain the sounds, the grave, the isolation? Share your theories with our community because we're about to go deeper into this darkness, and I want to know what you're thinking before we uncover what really happened on that mountain. Dr. Samuel Thornton, the only physician within 20 miles of Hickory Ridge, was shown the anonymous letter and asked his medical opinion. His response, recorded in a letter to Sheriff Garrett dated September 18, 1883, provides chilling context. You ask my professional opinion regarding the Edwards situation. I must first state that I have not examined either Scott or Mary Edwards, so I can only speculate. However, if the anonymous report is accurate regarding Mary Edwards being pregnant again, this would be at least the second pregnancy in 3 years of isolation with no male visitors except her brother. The implications are deeply troubling. Furthermore, if infant mortality is occurring on that property, there could be several explanations. Inadequate prenatal care, malnutrition, complications from inbreeding which can cause severe birth defects, or deliberate infanticide. Each possibility is more horrifying than the last. The doctor's letter concluded with a stark warning. Sheriff, I believe we are dealing with a situation of moral and criminal depravity that demands immediate intervention, regardless of the risks involved. If we do not act, we will bear responsibility for whatever continues to occur in that cabin. But acting was easier said than done. The Edwards cabin was on private property. Scott Edwards was armed and clearly willing to use violence to maintain his isolation. And most troubling of all, there was no definitive proof of any crime. Strange sounds, an anonymous letter, and a doctor's speculation were not sufficient grounds for a forced entry that could result in deaths. So Sheriff Garrett did what lawmen have always done when faced with impossible situations. He began gathering evidence, interviewing anyone who might have information, and documenting everything carefully, building a case that would justify action when the moment came. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized, because in that isolated cabin on the mountain, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The cries that Thomas Whitley had heard in August were no longer heard by anyone. The cabin had gone silent. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cooling autumn weather. And when a merchant's delivery boy rode up the mountain on October 15th with supplies that Scott Edwards had ordered weeks earlier, he found the order note still pinned to the tree at the property line, uncollected, fluttering in the cold wind like a ghost's whisper. Something had changed. Something had ended. And the community of Hickory Ridge was about to learn what horror had been festering in that cabin while they debated and waited and feared to act. On October 23, 1883, Sheriff Edmund Garrett assembled a party of 6 men for what he called in his official report a welfare check necessitated by extended silence from the Edwards property and credible concerns for the safety of its occupants. The party included the sheriff himself, 2 deputies, Reverend James Cross, Dr. Samuel Thornton, and Thomas Whitley, who knew the mountain trails better than anyone. They departed Hickory Ridge at dawn, carrying supplies for a potentially extended operation. The journey took nearly 3 hours, following the narrow trail that wound up through increasingly dense forest. The October air was cold, and a thin mist clung to the mountain. Hollows, giving the landscape an otherworldly quality that none of the men found comforting. As they approached the Edwards property, Reverend Cross noted in his journal that an unnatural silence hung over the hollow. No bird song, he wrote. No sound of wind through the trees. It was as if nature itself had withdrawn from this place, leaving only a void where life should be. The cabin came into view just after 9 in the morning. The sight that greeted them was unsettling even before they reached the door. The cabin appeared abandoned. One shutter hung loose, banging occasionally against the wall in a breeze too slight to be felt. The small vegetable garden that Mary Edwards had once tended was overgrown with weeds. The woodpile, which should have been stocked for winter, was nearly depleted. Sheriff Garrett called out, identifying himself and stating his business. No response came from within. He called again, louder this time, explaining that they were there to ensure the well-being of the occupants, and that if no one answered, they would be forced to enter. Still, nothing. Only that oppressive silence. The sheriff nodded to his deputies, and they approached the door. It was not locked. In that isolated place where visitors were unwelcome and never came uninvited, there had been no need for locks. The door swung open with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The smell hit them first. Dr. Thornton, who had encountered death in its many forms, later described it as a combination of decay, sickness, and something else, something that suggested prolonged suffering in an enclosed space. Several of the men covered their faces with handkerchiefs as they stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. What had once been a modest but functional living space had deteriorated into squalor. Dirty dishes were piled in the dry sink. Clothes lay scattered on the floor. The fireplace was cold and full of old ash, but it was what they saw in the corner that made Thomas Whitley turn and vomit outside the doorway. Scott Edwards hung from one of the rafters that supported the loft. A rope, tied to the beam and knotted around his neck, had done its work efficiently. His body swayed slightly in the draught from the open door. Dr. Thornton approached and examined the body without touching it initially. "Dead for at least a week," he announced quietly. "Perhaps longer. The cold has slowed decomposition." But where was Mary Edwards? The men searched the cabin thoroughly. They found her sleeping area in the loft, a mattress on the floor covered with stained blankets. They found women's clothing, personal items, evidence that she had lived there until recently. But Mary herself was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had simply vanished into the mountain mist. And then Reverend Cross made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Behind a loose board in the wall near the fireplace, Reverend Cross found a metal box. It was not locked, and when he opened it, he discovered a collection of documents that told a story more horrifying than anyone had imagined. There were 3 journals. The first belonged to Catherine Edwards, Scott and Mary's mother. The entries dated from 1875 to shortly before her death in 1880. The Reverend began reading aloud, his voice shaking as he realized what he was seeing. Catherine Edwards had been a deeply troubled woman. Her journal revealed years of depression, religious obsession, and a paranoid fear of the outside world. But more disturbing were her observations about her children. In an entry from September 1878, she wrote, "I have noticed the way Scott looks at his sister. It is not the way a brother should look. I have prayed for guidance, but God is silent. Robert does not see it, or perhaps he does not wish to see it. Mary is so beautiful, so innocent. I fear for her soul. I fear for all our souls. In this cursed place." Later entries grew darker. In January 1880, shortly after Robert's death and during her own final illness, Catherine wrote, "I am dying and I leave them alone together. God forgive me. I have failed as a mother. I see the way they are with each other now that Robert is gone and I am too weak to intervene. They think I do not notice, but I see everything. I see the touches, the looks, the way they whisper when they think I am sleeping. This is my punishment. My children are damned, and it is my fault for bringing them to this isolated hell." The final entry, written in a hand barely legible, stated simply, "Forgive them, Lord. for they know not what they do. But I know. I have always known. The second journal belonged to Scott Edwards. It began in March 1881, several months after his mother's death. The early entries were mundane: notes about repairs needed on the cabin, lists of supplies to purchase, observations about the weather. But gradually, the content changed. In June 1881, he wrote, "Mary and I have decided we will not seek others for marriage. We have each other. We need no one else. The people in town judge us, but they do not understand. They have never understood. In this place, there is only us. There has only ever been us." By September 1881, the entries had become more explicit, though Scott used careful, almost coded language. He wrote about their union and their sacred bond that transcends the laws of men. He justified their relationship with religious language, claiming they were like Adam and Eve, the first couple alone in their own garden, answerable only to God. Then came the entry from February 1882 that confirmed everyone's worst fears. "Mary is with child. We have created life from our love. Some would call this sin, but we know it is blessed. We will raise this child away from the judgment of the world, in the purity of our isolation." Dr. Thornton, reading over the Reverend's shoulder, closed his eyes. "Dear God," he whispered, "the medical implications alone." But the journal continued, and what came next was worse than anything they had read so far. Scott's journal entries from May 1882 documented the birth of the first child. The account was clinical, detached, as if he were recording the weather rather than describing his sister giving birth to their incestuous offspring in a cabin with no medical care. The child was born on May 7th in the early morning hours. Mary labored through the night. "I did what I could to help her, but I am not skilled in such matters. The child was small, and its cry was weak. Mary held it for 3 hours before it ceased breathing. We buried it behind the cabin, under the oak tree where our parents are buried. Mary wept, but I told her we would try again. God would bless us with a healthy child if we remained faithful." The men stood in horrified silence. Thomas Whitley, who had returned inside after recovering from his initial shock, shook his head slowly. "That was the crying I heard," he said quietly, "a dying baby." But the journal revealed that this was only the beginning. Mary became pregnant again in late 1882. This child was born in March 1883 and lived for 5 days before dying. A third pregnancy occurred almost immediately after, resulting in a birth in August 1883. This infant lived for nearly 2 weeks before perishing. Scott's entries about these deaths grew increasingly detached and disturbing. He recorded each birth and death with the same clinical precision, noting symptoms, duration of life, and burial location. He never questioned whether what they were doing was wrong. He never acknowledged that the children were dying because of the genetic consequences of incest, the lack of medical care, or the inadequate nutrition Mary was receiving. Instead, he blamed external forces. "The world has cursed us," he wrote in September 1883, "because we dare to love outside their rules. God takes our children from us." Or, "Perhaps it is not God but the devil who works through the judgment of men." Mary grows weaker with each loss. Her mind is breaking. She speaks to the children as if they are still alive. She sets places for them at our table. I fear she is lost to madness, and I fear I may be following her there. The final entry in Scott's journal was dated October 15th, 1883. "I cannot continue. Mary has disappeared into the forest. She took the shovel and said she was going to dig up the babies, to bring them inside where they would be warm. I tried to stop her, but she fought me with a strength I did not know she possessed. She ran into the woods, and I cannot find her. I have searched for 3 days. I call her name, but only the wind answers. Perhaps it is better this way. Perhaps we deserve this end. I will join my children and my parents in the ground behind this cursed cabin. May God have mercy on our souls, though I know we deserve none." Reverend Cross closed the journal with trembling hands. He waited for her to return, he said quietly. When she didn't, he couldn't bear to go on. But there was still one more journal to read. The third journal belonged to Mary Edwards, and it was the most heartbreaking of all. Her entries, written in a delicate, educated hand that deteriorated over time into barely legible scrawls, revealed a woman trapped in circumstances she felt powerless to escape. Her first entry, from January 1881, read, "Mother is gone. Father is gone. There is only Scott. And me now. He says we will never be separated. He says we belong together. I do not know if this is right, but I know I am afraid to be alone." The progression of the relationship was documented in painful detail. Mary wrote about her guilt, her shame, her sense that she was committing terrible sins. But she also wrote about her fear of abandonment, her terror of being left alone in that isolated cabin, her desperate need for human connection in a world where there was only one other person. "He is my brother," she wrote in April 1881, "but he is also the only person who has ever truly seen me. Is it wrong to love him? The Bible says it is, but the Bible also says God knows our hearts. Surely he understands that we mean no harm. Surely he sees that we are only trying to survive in this lonely place." By the time of her first pregnancy, Mary's entries revealed a woman trying desperately to convince herself that everything would be fine. She wrote about the baby as a blessing, a sign that their love was pure, despite what others might think. She made plans for the child's future, imagined teaching it to read, to work the land, to love the mountains as she did. The death of that first child shattered something in Mary. Her journal entries became erratic, jumping between hope and despair. After the second death, they became increasingly disconnected from reality. She wrote letters to the dead children, asking them why they had left her, begging them to come back. She described seeing them in the cabin, playing in the corners, sleeping in a cradle that existed only in her mind. Her final entry, dated October 12, 1883, was the most disturbing of all. "The babies are cold in the ground. I can hear them crying for me. I must bring them inside. I must warm them. Scott says they are dead, but he is wrong. They are only sleeping. I will dig them up and bring them home, and we will be a family again. We will all be together. The cold cannot have them. The earth cannot have them. They are mine." Dr. Thornton set down the journal and walked outside, unable to bear any more. Sheriff Garrett looked at Reverend Cross. "She was completely mad by the end," the sheriff said. "Can you blame her?" the Reverend replied. 3 children, born of sin and shame, dying one after another while she lived in isolation with only her brother, who was both the father of her children and the architect of her destruction. Her mind had no choice but to break. The men went outside to search the grounds. Behind the cabin, they found a small area under an oak tree where 4 graves had been dug. 3 were small, clearly meant for infants. They were marked with crude wooden crosses, each carved with a date but no name. The 4th grave was larger, older, the burial site of Robert and Catherine Edwards, but between these graves and the cabin, they found something that would haunt the nightmares of every man present: fresh digging, multiple holes, shallow and desperate, where someone had attempted to excavate the infant graves. The tiny remains, disturbed and partially exposed, told the story of Mary's final descent into complete madness. She had tried to dig up her dead children, and then, apparently unable to complete this horrific task, or perhaps realizing the full horror of what she was doing, she had fled into the forest, into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. from which she would never return. The Edwards case was officially closed. In November 1883, Scott Edwards's body was buried in the town cemetery, not in the family plot behind the cabin. The decision was made by community consensus that he should not rest beside the children and parents he had dishonored. Mary Edwards was declared missing, presumed dead. The cabin was boarded up, the property seized by the county for unpaid taxes, and within a few years, the forest began to reclaim what the Edwards family had carved from it. The story became local legend, whispered about, but rarely discussed openly. It was too dark, too shameful, too disturbing for polite conversation. The older generation wanted to forget. The younger generation learned only vague details, enough to know that the old Edwards place was cursed, that something terrible had happened there, but not enough to understand the full horror. For decades, the cabin stood empty and rotting, slowly collapsing into the mountain earth. The trail that led to it became overgrown. The memory faded. The case files remained in the county archives, gathering dust, waiting for someone to rediscover them. That rediscovery came in 1952, 69 years after the tragedy. Professor Margaret Ashford, a historian from the University of North Carolina who specialized in Appalachian social history, was researching her doctoral dissertation on isolated mountain communities in the post-Civil War era. She was examining records in the Mitchell County Courthouse when she stumbled upon the Edwards case files. In her published dissertation, Isolation and Moral Decay in Appalachian Communities, 1865–1900, Dr. Ashford dedicated an entire chapter to the Edwards case. She was the first scholar to approach the tragedy with academic rigor, analyzing the social, economic, and psychological factors that contributed to what she called the complete moral collapse of two individuals removed from all civilizing influences. Dr. Ashford's work brought renewed attention to the case. She interviewed several elderly residents of Hickory Ridge who remembered hearing stories from their grandparents about the Edwards situation. One of these interviews, conducted in August 1953 with a woman named Ethel Morrison, aged 87, proved particularly revealing. Mrs. Morrison's grandmother had been Sarah Mitchell, the woman who reported hearing sounds from the Edwards property in 1883. Before her death in 1920, Sarah had confided to her granddaughter the full truth of what she had witnessed. "My grandmother told me," Mrs. Morrison said in the recorded interview, "that she had been closer to that cabin than she admitted to the sheriff. She had crept right up to the window. She saw Mary Edwards inside, heavily pregnant, and she saw the way Scott touched her, the way they were with each other. She knew immediately what was happening, but she was terrified to say so openly because people didn't speak of such things back then. So she wrote the anonymous letter instead. She carried guilt about that for the rest of her life. She felt if she had been braver, if she had spoken up sooner, maybe something could have been saved." Dr. Ashford also made an attempt to visit the Edwards property. By 1952, the cabin had collapsed entirely, leaving only a stone foundation and a chimney standing like a tombstone against the sky. But behind where the cabin had stood, she found the small cemetery still intact. The wooden crosses marking the infant graves had rotted away, but the depressions in the earth remained visible. Dr. Ashford photographed the site and included those haunting images in her dissertation. The academic attention brought by Dr. Ashford's work sparked interest from other researchers. In 1967, a team of anthropologists from Duke University, led by Dr. Raymond Fletcher, obtained permission to excavate the Edwards property as part of a broader study on mortality in 19th-century Appalachian communities. What they found confirmed the worst of the documentary evidence. The remains of 3 infants were carefully exhumed and examined. Dr. Fletcher's report, published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 1968, provided medical evidence of what the journals had described. The skeletal remains showed signs of severe developmental abnormalities consistent with inbreeding. One infant had a significantly malformed skull. Another showed evidence of spinal defects. The third, while less severely affected, would not have survived long even with modern medical care. These children, Dr. Fletcher wrote in his conclusion, were doomed from conception. The genetic consequences of the incestuous relationship between Scott and Mary Edwards virtually guaranteed that any offspring would suffer from serious congenital defects. Combined with the lack of prenatal care, inadequate nutrition, and the absence of medical assistance during birth, it is remarkable that any of the infants survived even as long as they did. This case represents one of the most tragic, documented examples of how isolation and moral transgression can result in genetic catastrophe. The infants were reburied with proper ceremony in 1967, this time in consecrated ground in the Hickory Ridge Methodist Church Cemetery. Reverend Thomas Caldwell, who presided over the service, spoke about forgiveness and the innocence of children who bear no responsibility for the sins of their parents. But even after the excavation and reburial, new information about the Edwards case continued to emerge. In 1974, a construction crew working on a new Forest Service road in the mountains, northeast of the old Edwards property, made a discovery that reopened questions everyone thought had been settled. They found human remains. A woman's skeleton, partially buried in a shallow depression beneath a rocky overhang, protected from the elements but clearly undisturbed for decades. With the remains were fragments of cloth, buttons, and a locket. Inside the locket was a small photograph, water-damaged but still identifiable. It showed a young woman and a young man, clearly Scott and Mary Edwards, in what appeared to be a wedding photograph, though no record of any such marriage existed in county records. Dental records, examined by a forensic specialist in 1975, confirmed that the remains were those of Mary Edwards. She had apparently wandered approximately 6 miles from the cabin before succumbing to exposure, exhaustion, or perhaps simply the will to die. Her body had lain in that remote spot for 91 years before being found. Mary Edwards was finally buried in 1976 next to the graves of her children. The headstone, paid for by the Mitchell County Historical Society, reads simply, Mary Edwards, 1857-1883, found at last. May she rest in peace. The discovery of Mary's remains prompted one final investigation into the case. In 1978, local historian David Brennan, a retired schoolteacher with a passion for Appalachian history, gained access to additional documents that had been stored in the attic of the old Methodist church in Hickory Ridge. Among these documents, he found a letter that had never been entered into the official case files. It was a letter from Dr. Samuel Thornton to Reverend James Cross, dated November 1883, 1 month after the discovery of the tragedy. In the letter, Dr. Thornton expressed his own guilt and anguish over the case. He wrote, "I should have acted sooner. We all should have. We saw the signs, heard the reports, understood what was likely happening, but we hesitated because we feared confrontation. We told ourselves we needed more evidence, more proof, that we couldn't simply force our way onto private property without cause. But in our hesitation, how many children died? How many more might Mary have been forced to bear and lose? I will carry this burden for the rest of my days. This case has taught me that sometimes the law and social conventions must be violated in the service of preventing greater evil. I only wish I had learned that lesson before it was too late." Brennan published his findings in a book titled Mountain Shadows: Dark History of the North Carolina Appalachians in 1980. The Edwards case formed the centerpiece of his work, presented not just as a story of individual moral failure, but as an indictment of a society that allowed isolation to become so extreme that people could disappear into darkness without anyone intervening until it was too late. The Edwards cabin site is now part of a protected forest area. There are no markers, no signs indicating what happened there. Only those who study local history know the significance of that lonely hollow where a stone foundation and a small cemetery remain hidden among the trees. Sometimes hikers stumble upon the place by accident and wonder about the story behind those sad, small graves. Most move on quickly. The place has an atmosphere, they say, a heaviness, a sense that something terrible happened there, even if they don't know what. And perhaps that's appropriate. Some stories are too dark to be commemorated, too painful to be marked with monuments. They exist in archives and academic papers, in whispered local legends, and in the cautionary tales we tell about what can happen when human beings are left too long in isolation, away from the restraining influence of community, morality, and law. So we come to the end of this dark journey into the mountains of North Carolina, to the story of Scott and Mary Edwards and the tragedy that unfolded in their isolated cabin in 1883. But as with so many of these historical mysteries, the end is not really an ending at all. It is simply the point where the documented facts stop and interpretation begins. The question that has haunted researchers for over a century is this: who bears the true responsibility for what happened in that cabin? Was this simply a case of two individuals who chose moral depravity, who consciously decided to violate the most fundamental taboos of human society? Or is the truth more complicated, more tragic, more difficult to judge? One theory, the one favored by most contemporary observers in 1883, holds that Scott Edwards was the primary aggressor, that he took advantage of his sister's vulnerability after their parents' deaths to manipulate her into an incestuous relationship. This interpretation views Mary as a victim, a woman trapped by isolation, fear, and the complete absence of any alternative. Supporting this view are Mary's journal entries, which consistently express guilt, confusion, and a sense of being trapped in circumstances beyond her control. She never claims to have initiated the relationship. She never expresses joy in it, only a desperate rationalization born of loneliness and terror of abandonment. Dr. Margaret Ashford, in her 1952 dissertation, argued strongly for this interpretation. She wrote, "Mary Edwards was a prisoner in all but name, physically isolated in a remote mountain cabin, psychologically dependent on her brother for survival and human contact, religiously indoctrinated to submit to male authority. She had no real choice in what occurred." Scott Edwards created the conditions of their isolation by refusing all offers of help and violently rejecting any attempt by the community to intervene. He controlled every aspect of their lives. The tragedy is that Mary paid the ultimate price for his crimes, bearing and losing 3 children, descending into madness, and dying alone in the wilderness. But there is another interpretation, one that some scholars find equally compelling. This view suggests that both Scott and Mary were victims of circumstances that stripped away their moral framework and left them psychologically unable to resist the pull toward transgression. Proponents of this theory point to Catherine Edwards' journal, which suggests that the attraction between the siblings may have existed even before their parents' deaths, that the seeds of the tragedy were planted in childhood by the extreme isolation in which they were raised. Dr. Raymond Fletcher, in his 1968 anthropological study, wrote, "We must consider the possibility that Scott and Mary Edwards genuinely believed their relationship was acceptable, that years of isolation had so disconnected them from normal social frameworks that they could not see their actions as others would." Scott's journals show no sense of predatory behavior. He writes of love, of partnership, of creating a family. He is delusional, certainly, but not necessarily malicious. Both siblings were, in a sense, victims of a culture that allowed families to exist in such profound isolation that all normal moral development became impossible. A third theory, the darkest of all, suggests that the true villain of this story was not Scott Edwards, but the community of Hickory Ridge itself. This interpretation argues that the townspeople had multiple opportunities to intervene, that they received clear warnings that something terrible was happening, but they chose inaction because it was easier, because confronting the truth would have been uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. This view is supported by Dr. Thornton's letter from 1883, in which he explicitly accepts responsibility for his own inaction. It is supported by Sarah Mitchell's deathbed confession that she had witnessed more than she reported. It is supported by the fact that Sheriff Garrett received reports of infant cries as early as August 1883, but did not force entry to the property until October, by which time at least one more child had died. Local historian David Brennan put it bluntly in his 1980 book. The community of Hickory Ridge allowed the Edwards tragedy to occur through their collective cowardice. They valued property rights and social conventions over human lives. They chose comfort over confrontation. And because of that choice, 3 infants died. Mary Edwards descended into madness, and Scott Edwards hanged himself in despair. This is not just the story of 2 individuals who failed morally. It is the story of an entire community that failed ethically. Which interpretation is correct? Perhaps all of them contain elements of truth. Perhaps the Edwards tragedy cannot be reduced to simple narratives of victims and villains. Perhaps it is what it appears to be on the surface, an impossibly complicated human tragedy born of isolation, poverty, limited choices, psychological damage, and the complete absence of any support system that might have prevented the spiral into darkness. What we know for certain is this. To this day, no one knows the full truth of what occurred in that cabin between 1880 and 1883. We have the journals, the official reports, the physical evidence, but we cannot truly know what was in the hearts and minds of Scott and Mary Edwards as they made the choices that led to their destruction. We cannot know if they felt love or merely desperation, if they acted from desire or from the simple inability to imagine any other way to survive their isolation. The graves remain in the mountains of North Carolina, marked now with proper headstones, tended occasionally by those who remember the story. The hollow where the cabin once stood is quiet, empty except for the wind through the trees and the occasional hiker who stumbles upon the ruins without knowing their significance. And perhaps that is how it should be. Some stories resist easy conclusions. Some tragedies are too complex for simple moral judgments. The Edwards case stands as a reminder of what can happen when human beings are pushed to the absolute limits of isolation, when all the normal structures of society fall away, and when no one intervenes until it is far too late. Now I want to hear from you, our community of truth seekers and history explorers. What do you think really happened in that cabin? Who bears the responsibility? Was Mary Edwards a victim or a willing participant? Could the community have done more? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another journey into the darkest corners of history. Share this video with others who appreciate true historical mysteries that challenge our understanding of human nature. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey. Until next time, when we explore another forgotten story from America's shadowed past, remember that history is not always comfortable, but it is always worth examining. The truth, however dark, deserves to be told. This is your host, signing off. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you in the next investigation.